All right. Okay. So welcome everyone to another session from Virtual Medical Educators. Today's a unique session. It's very highly specialized in type 1 diabetes and technology. With us today is Mr. Tim Street. Tim is an advocate for DIY and We're Not Waiting movement. He's the director of DiabTech blog and he lives with type 1 diabetes. We're happy to have Tim. If you have any questions, please put them at the end of the session. We'll give some time for questions and answers. And you can also put the questions on the Facebook page and on the chat box here. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just get the slides up. So hopefully everybody can now see the slides that we've got in place. So what am I here to talk about? Oh, I think I've just lost Zoom, so hang on a minute.
We can see the slides perfectly, Tim.
You can still see the slides, you can still hear me?
Yeah.
Right, we'll try and carry on.
And we can see you as well.
We can hear you, see you, and see the slides.
Perfect, and then Microsoft is lying to me a little bit. So, DIY diabetes, not waiting for industry is the subtitle on that. So before we get started, just a few disclosures. I've spoken on this topic at a number of places, to Diabetes Mine, EASD Education, and also on behalf of the Night Scout Foundation at the ATTD conference this year in Madrid. So what am I going to talk about? So DIY diabetes, what is it? I can give you a little bit of history about it. We'll move on to closed loops and what's happened in that space. What does it look like in the UK? And why do people use an unregulated solution? And firstly, I'll apologise that there is a cat who will probably join me in the presentation from time to time who enjoys participating in conference calls. So do it yourself and we are not waiting. What does that actually cover? Well, it covers a fairly large range of things. There are monitoring and reporting tools, there's decision support tools, and there is closed loop. And each of those can be used separately or together as a different set of things. So starting off with monitoring. Monitoring encompasses a number of different bits of technology that we've got in place here. On your Android phone, you can have an application that will receive multiple different CGM and adapted flash glucose monitors with pieces of hardware data to give you real-time CGM from a flash system. That can run on an Android phone, it can run on an iPhone. They're slightly different pieces of software, but they enable you to get access to real-time data with fully customizable alarms and some level of predictive information to help you determine what's going on with your glucose levels and what's about to happen. You can also get that information on a watch, which is obviously much more discreet than being able to have to pull out a phone or a receiver or look at your pump all the time. On the top right of that slide, you can see Night Scout, which is the core component of a lot of the We Are Not Waiting systems. It's a remote monitoring solution that allows anybody to see their child's or their partner's or somebody they care for's glucose levels. And it also provides some great reporting tools to allow users to be able to generate similar types of reports to those you might get in Clarity or you might get in the Abbott systems. And finally, in the middle there's a little picture of a phone connected to a Medtronic / Roche, not Roche, Essentia blood glucose meter that can be used to connect to the 670 and 640 series of pumps and upload that data, including all of the dosing data that comes off the 670, also to Night Scout to give somebody the ability to see what that's doing as well. Decision support tools are also available there, where you take real insulin DIA curves, so that's duration of insulin action, and they build on the monitoring tools to provide information about what future glucose levels might be, telling you whether or not you might need carbohydrate or whether or not you might need insulin. The bolus calculators are also able to use that information to better provide bolus indications, and you can tell it whether you want it to take into account the blood glucose from the monitor, whether you want to take into account various other factors to generate a better outcome. In addition, there is a tool available that allows you to generate an estimate of what basal should be. Now, a lot of people use that with closed loops, but you can also use it with a standard pump, and what it requires is Night Scout, and also you're also required to make sure you're entering carbohydrate and insulin dosing details into the system so that it can figure out some other factors in there as well. Key point about all of these is they're only as good as the data you give them, and they're not containing any artificial intelligence type algorithms or machine learning, unlike some of the solutions that are available from Diaboloop, CAM-APS, and latterly Medtronic. And finally, we moved into the current DIY closed loop systems. At this point, I'll just be very brief and say there's Loop on EOS, Open APS, which runs on a separate device, and Android APS, which people are probably most familiar with. I'm not going to go into too much detail at this point because we'll talk about them a little bit later on. But what about the history of all of this? Well, the history really starts with Night Scout. What it all started with was parents wanting remote monitoring. And going back to 2012, 2013, John Kostick realized that the Dexcom G4 receiver had a USB port on it, and then realized that when he plugged it into his computer, the data flow across that port was completely unencrypted. So he started off by having the G4 receiver connected to a laptop, enabling that to be distributed out. And as he progressed from there, he and a number of other people in the US figured out that it was a radio signal from the G4 that was, again, unencrypted and broadcast that could be picked up. And they progressed on to building a bridge that was able to interpret the data from the Dexcom G4, turn it into a Bluetooth signal so that your phone could pick it up, and that's where the Xtrip app I talked about previously was born. Around about the same time, before we get on to that, with all of that data, it was being pushed through to this centralized CGM monitoring system called Night Scout that allowed parents to go to bed with this on an iPad in their bedroom or on a phone in their bedroom or a laptop while their child was sleeping next door and see what was happening to their blood glucose all night. They didn't have to go and check the receiver in the room. And this, of course, was well before Share was available from Dexcom, because Dexcom had been talking about Share for a long time but never actually released it. So they finally arrived at the decision that they were going to make this available to the wider world, and the growth in take-up of it has been phenomenal. And prior to Share being available, it's understandable why. And as a result of those things being made available, we were able to get CGM reuse and better display options. So the ability to see your glucose on your watch. It's a phenomenal way of doing it. And again, it's something that Dexcom had to do when they released the G5. You had other tools like rechargeable Dexcom transmitters, which are enabled by the fact that the software on the Android phones and on the iPhone are able to allow you to reuse older transmitters. Having said that, with the G6 and the more recent codes that end with letters starting with the G, that's no longer been possible, which is disappointing for a lot of people due to the price. Additionally, people were reusing sensors because they were finding that when you're just using it for a glucose reading, actually, once you get beyond the 7 days of the G5 or the 5 days of the G4 or the 10 days of the G6, actually the data that's coming off isn't as bad as you might think it would be, and therefore people were continuing to use this and to generate plots, keeping an eye on everything and making sure that they were aware of the variability that was in there. I've also included Meow Meow in there because Meow Meow is something that many of you will have come across. And Meow Meow came about as originally a piece of hardware development that was done in the We Are Not Waiting community. There was a hardware design called Limiter that you could build yourself by buying the components, soldering bits of wire together, and then you could wrap it around your arm and it would generate real-time data from the Libre flash data. So effectively what it was doing, it was triggering a flash every 5 minutes and then transmitting that data to Xtrip on the mobile phone that allowed you to have real-time data. All of the products that are now available to buy to turn a Libre into a CGM are beholden to that piece of open source community development that was done 5 years ago. At the same time as all of that was going on, a gentleman called Ben West in San Francisco had got fed up of CareLink to the extent that he wanted to be able to remove the data from his Medtronic pump and use that himself rather than store it in Medtronic's proprietary CareLink with no access to his own data. He linked up with Dana Lewis and Scott Librand, and together they had been writing an algorithm to take the data from the glucose sensors and predict what was going to happen so that they could open loop adjust Dana's insulin, whilst Ben was able to come in and help them to merge that with his understanding of how Medtronic communicated with the CareLink stick to generate the first closed loop that was made available through DIY, which was back in 2015. Whilst all of this was going on, there were a lot of discussions with lawyers and there was a lot of searching for questions as to whether this was going to be okay and what the outcomes might be. And all of them have arrived at the same place, which is that it's being done as a community in open source. And as long as it was released as the code to it, then under the US, it fell under I think it's the First Amendment, so the right to free speech. Because you're not distributing a medical product at that point, you're just distributing some code that someone has to do something with if they want to make anything out of it. So, back on the topic of closed loops. In 2015, 2016 or so, this is what a closed loop, a DIY closed loop looked like. You had Dexcom G4 receiver, you had a Raspberry Pi, you had a Medtronic pump, you had a CareLink stick or a radio stick, and you had a blooming great big battery. And OpenAPS still adheres to this model, but the scale of it has compressed dramatically. So it's now available on a much smaller piece of hardware, known as an Edison or as a Raspberry Pi. That's the Raspberry Pi without a battery attached to it, which you can run this system on. And that's the Edison. I would hold them up side by side, and you can see that's the Edison, that's the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi is a little bit bigger. OpenAPS is able to take data from a number of different sources, so it can use the Libre with one of the adapters, so Meow Meow or Bluecon or Bubble. It uses Dexcom G5 and Dexcom G6 directly to the board and directly to the device itself, and it communicates with Medtronic pumps only. And it can actually use the old MiniMed and Lite combination of sensors if you wanted to do that. The algorithm is developed within, for the most part, within the OpenAPS world, and then distributed to Android APS as a result of that. And of course, it provides an upload of all the information to Nightscout, which is a core component of the system. You've probably also come across Loop, which is the iPhone open DIY closed loop. Now, Loop runs on a very different algorithm to OpenAPS. As it's running on EOS, the guy who wrote it, Nate Ratcliffe, wanted a beautiful interface. He was an Apple developer and he was able to achieve it. And it's probably the best looking of the systems out there at the moment. Again, you can use various Dexcom and Libre adapters to be able to get the data in. It will also support Minimed and Elite and Lite coming through the Minimed pump. The phone communicates with the Minimed pump or with an Omnipod pump through a little device called a Riley Link. And that, mine doesn't look quite like that. That's what a Riley Link looks like. It's a little white box that is a translator from Bluetooth to the radio signals that the Omnipod Eros and the Minimed pump use. You tend to see quite a lot of use of Loop because people have iPhones and they like that interface, but the algorithm is different from that of OpenAPS. Android APS, which is the probably the most common in Europe, is an implementation of OREF1, which is the OpenAPS algorithm. Android APS is a modular system which allows it to have pump drivers and CGM drivers plugged into it to allow it to work with a multitude of different pumps. So at the moment, direct via Bluetooth, you can use an AccuCheck Insight, an AccuCheck Spirit Combo, or a Dana RS. You can use a Medtronic, or you can use an Omnipod via Riley Link, as Loop does. But it also allows access to multiple different CGM systems. So you can use Freestyle Libre, as we've described on the other two platforms, the various Dexcom systems. And it also allows you to use Eversense as another alternative. And as work is done to develop things like PopTech and some of the other alternative CGMs into Xtrip, then they will integrate directly with Android's APS as a result of having that Xtrip integration. And if you require the Clarity feed, there is a modified version of the Dexcom app that can also run on your Android phone, transmitting data to Android APS, but also feeding Clarity. So living with DIY technology requires some care and attention. Firstly, with CGM, if you have bad data and you feed the Loop with bad CGM data, then the outcomes aren't necessarily going to want to be what you want them to be. So for those people using converters to turn a Libre into a real-time CGM system, the users have to be careful about how they calibrate, when they calibrate, and make sure that they don't over or under calibrate. You have to be able to sense check the data that's coming through, and this is true for anyone using a DIY or commercial closed loop. Does the CGM data match how you feel? Does the CGM data make sense? And you'll see it on Facebook groups and Twitter, people complaining about Dexcom G6s against the Tandem T Slim with the data that's coming out of the Dexcom not making any sense at all and causing them issues on the Control IQ system. So sense checking your data is critical whether you're using a commercial or a DIY system. And if you're using double DIY, i.e. Libre or Eversense with Xtrip, then you really do need to make sure you are aware of the things that can go wrong. You also need to be able to recognize noise in your data, because that usually means that if you've been extending sensors, for example, you need to change them, or it can be an indication that the sensor you're currently using has gone bad early and that you may need to change it. Because when you get noise, you tend to get jumpy values, and when you get jumpy values, the algorithm has to try and deal with that, so it's not ideal. And finally, there's the life cycle. What we've seen from various n=1 pieces of experimentation is that with both the commercial real-time and the adapted flash CGMs, early on in their life, the data readings aren't always as reliable, and towards the end of their life, the data readings aren't always as reliable. And it tends to be horses for courses. So some people have a much better outcome than others. As a result, we recommend that people are aware of the variation and observe the variation of what's happening to their CGM data when it's first new and when it has the trauma effects and as it gets older, because that can have an effect as well. The other thing with DIY systems that's different to most of the commercial systems, I say most because the T-Slim also has this factor involved with Control IQ, is the settings. Now, every single one of the systems that I'm aware of, apart from CAM APS, allows you to adjust the duration of insulin action. Why is this important? Well, the DIY systems default to 5 hours, and most people find that they tend to get a better result when they operate between 6 and 8 hours. And we know for a fact that that's the amount of time it takes for insulin to get out of your system. The algorithms seem to work better with that. We also know that, for example, the Medtronic 780G works best with a duration of 2 hours. So their algorithm is doing something very different from those of the DIY world and the likes of CAM APS and Control IQ. It's a question that's potentially worth asking there. Basal rates are also important in DIY because the way the algorithms work, they use that as their background value against which they then assess how much insulin to deliver. Given that if you have your basal rates wrong, you generally will have your ISF and your carb ratio, ISF being insulin sensitivity factor, wrong, you need to try and get your basal rates correct before you get going. As I've mentioned, insulin sensitivity factor also plays a part. And what this particular image shows is that as the glucose levels rise and the insulin is delivered, you then get a drop and you get this kind of waveform. And what this is demonstrating in this particular case is that the insulin sensitivity factor is actually set to be too aggressive. So what essentially it's been set as is that somebody has told the system that they might drop 1.5 millimole per litre per unit of insulin, when the reality is they actually drop 2 millimole, so they would need to adjust out of that. And then similarly with carb ratio, if you've stated a number that is, again, overly aggressive, so that 1 unit of insulin is equivalent to 5 grams of carbs for you, and the reality is that it's equivalent to 10, all of these things go into the calculations that the algorithm is making, because the algorithms are based off maths which come from the maths we do on a daily basis as a person with type 1 to calculate our insulin for meals and our correction values. And that's where the core of these algorithms come from. It's pretty much basic diabetes maths automated into these systems. Now, around meal times, it's also worth mentioning that a loop is not magic, and insulin is mostly slow. And sometimes people forget this when they start using closed loops of any type. The result of that is that you need to have a bolusing strategy and know how the loop works and deals with these things. And actually the same is also true with the commercial systems, which I found out when I trialed CAM APS for a little bit. And when I say a bolusing strategy, one of the key things you're able to do in DIY systems is this idea of eating soon, where what you do is you set a temporary target roughly an hour before your meal, and that temporary target will be, let's say, 4 millimole per litre, or 80 milligrams, 70 milligrams per deciliter. What you're aiming to do is to tell the system you need more insulin rather than having a target of during the day of, say, 6 millimole per litre. So it starts to deliver a little bit more insulin ahead of your meal. Then when you eat and you take a mealtime bolus, you've already got insulin on board that is ready to deal with whatever food it is you're eating. And what we're showing here is that when you have eating soon an hour before the meal, and then you meal bolus fit between 15 minutes before and the meal itself, you tend to get a much reduced postprandial spike. Now, I mention that because when I moved on to CAM APS to try it out, I was used to eating soon, and with DIY systems, you can schedule eating soon periods around the meal time so that when you come to eat, it's already happened. And if you forget to bolus and forget to tell it about carbs, on Android APS and on Open APS, it will figure out that actually you've eaten something and will then adjust insulin more aggressively would if you hadn't had that eating soon in place. So I found I was suffering quite significant postprandial spikes, and what that demonstrates is that even with commercial closed loop systems, you have to remember to pre-bolus if you don't want to go high in the period. And again, that's because insulin is mostly slow, even with FIASP and even with, but we hope that early, or Liumjev as it's known, becomes available soon, because that appears to have a much faster action time and could very well work with the OREF1 algorithm in OpenAPS and Android APS to deliver a no bolus meal for most people. The other thing is about carb absorption. Carbs obviously absorb at different rates, and the combination of carbs and fat and protein have all sorts of funny effects. Carbs absorb much more quickly than the insulin does, so this is why the bolusing strategy is really important. Carb absorption is also handled differently by the different systems. OREF1 observes your carb absorption based on the deviations from your expected blood glucose based on insulin data. Loop requires you to enter a carb absorption period when you enter your meal. And so if you have a meal which is has a portion of carbs and a portion of protein, you probably need to enter them separately with different absorption periods if you want to get the best out of it. It then dynamically adjusts the carb absorption based on the data that it sees, but it does need that piece up front to get you going. As I've mentioned, long-acting foods come into play as well, and those aren't always the most straightforward to deal with. Everybody's heard the stories about pizza, Chinese food, etc. By observing carb absorption, OpenAPS and Android APS are able to help with that, with pizzas. Loop to some extent as well. Loop's, as I mentioned, more dependent upon what you put in up front. But you also have the ability to do a few other things, which includes adding in carbs in the future to take account of things you know will happen in terms of absorption in relation to long-acting foods, such that it will then deliver insulin when it sees any deviations associated with those. That's a useful and helpful tool that you have available to you when using DIY closed loops. That's less easy to do in a commercial system. But the key thing here is that these things all help, and they all help to give you better outcomes as a result. So taking a quick step into the UK, we ran a survey in May 2019. We're a bit behind on getting one out here. Obviously, various things have come into play. And that was 148 responses, which, based on what we know about hardware shipments and what we know about users of the various systems, at the time we estimated was around a third of the overall users. Obviously, since then, those numbers will have increased. And at the time, Android APS accounted for approximately 2/3 of the users, with Loop accounting for roughly a quarter, and then OpenAPS just about everything else. I would hazard a guess that that's now migrated even further, as Omnipod is widely available on the Loop platform and much more accessible on Android APS as well, and there will be more Omnipod users doing that. As you can see in this survey, a year ago, the Dana RS was and the Medtronic loopable pumps were the most used, with Roche and Omnipod also playing a part. But what's quite interesting is that people using it are split across all ages and across all genders. And you can see that there are a broad mix of men and women using it. There is a high proportion, actually, of under 16-year-olds using it. That was about 21%. Obviously, there's a big part of that is parents starting to use the systems with their children. And then there is a question as to whether they continue to use them as they go into their teenage years and beyond. some of the feedback I've had has included 14-year-old coming off using a DIY system and actually going back onto pens because they didn't want the pump there, showing off the fact that they had diabetes. So whilst there are a significant proportion who are under the age of 16, over a fifth, the question is whether they continue with it, and that's not data that I know has been captured so far. At the point in time I put this presentation together, there is an estimated 15.8 million loop hours on DIY APS systems. Actually, the number on the bottom there is not quite right because it was only based on a 18/7 usage. You consider that this is a year ago that this presentation was put together, and there are 16 million loop hours on DIY APS systems. To get through the trials and get made public by the FDA, the total number of loop hours in use was something in the region of 400,000 per system that's gone on. So there's actually a significant amount of usage in the wild on these systems, and that is quite mind-blowing when you think about it. So that moves us on to the why. The algorithms and often the CGM solutions in place are not approved by regulators. So why do people use them? Well, people use them because of many reasons. As you can see here, we have a whole list of why people are using them for both parents and for adults with diabetes. For adults in general, the biggest scores go to achieving better glycemic control and reducing the occurrence of acute complications, followed by putting it into autopilot. But actually, that putting it into autopilot is as big a deal for parents as it is for is a bigger deal for parents, and as big a deal for parents as achieving better overall glycemic control. There's also in that list for parents, probably the biggest on their responses was improving sleep quality of the parent, partner, or family. This data is extracted from the Open Project DIY survey, which ran in 2019, and is a fascinating source of data for understanding why people do what they do. As I mentioned, parents and users expect to get better outcomes. A study was done looking at the outcomes comparing sensor-augmented pump therapy and DIY systems. And this was where people had moved from sensor-augmented pump onto DIY. And the outcomes that were shown were quite significantly different. So if you look at the time in range, for example, the time in range of the Open APS users in this context was on a 3.9 to 10 level, approximately 81% compared to around 70%. Now, bearing in mind that these people who have gone from a sensor-augmented pump to a DIY system are generally more careful about the way they manage their diabetes, that's still quite a significant jump. And then if we look at the 3.9 to 7.8 range, you can see that that was quite significantly higher. And again, the other thing to look at is the range of responses is tightened up, regardless of where the actual median is in all of those. The other thing of interest is that the time spent greater than 10 millimole per litre is obviously significantly lower in the DIY system users compared to the sensor-augmented pump users. Similarly, this splits out the data into a slightly different view with time in range and out of range during the daytime, again with the same ranges we just discussed, and then the nighttime data as well. And I think perhaps what was most interesting for me was the hypoglycemic events data, which showed that in a 24-hour period, the hypoglycemic events during the daytime were substantially reduced as a result of using a DIY system, whereas overnight, with the sensor-augmented pump system, it was very similar. There are also multiple non-clinical benefits, as we've mentioned already. the system doesn't get stressed, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't have to look after kids, which means you forget to bolus, or you forget that you've bolused and then don't eat. Takes that weight away from you. It responds more precisely than humans as well. So every time it adjusts, it looks at things and makes adjustments. It does that every 5 minutes, every hour, and never gets concerned about thinking about it. Just a second. And finally, it doesn't sleep. So most people with diabetes can, and parents of people with diabetes, in order to be able to get the rest that they need. And there is quite a lot of evidence that lack of sleep generates other problems. We know that there have been studies that show it makes people less productive, and that there is a greater risk of crashing a car, for example, when you are tired. I've had anecdotal feedback that parents getting up in the middle of the night with a CGM alarm for a high have noticed that the child is high and given an insulin dose, forgotten to log it, gone to bed. The next parent gets up at the next alarm, does it again because they haven't realised that the other person has done it, and so the child ends up going low as a result. So you have these kinds of things going on as well. And that's quite a big thing for both parents and the people with diabetes. No more fear of the dark. And because they're as safe as sensor-augmented pumps. This year at ADA, Dana Lewis published a study. It was on a poster that she did with a number of other people. It was titled, Do-It-Yourself Artificial Pancreas Systems for Type 1 Diabetes Reduce Hyperglycemia Without Increasing Hypoglycemia. The list of people's at the bottom, and there's a link to the PDF of the poster there on the slide as well. And if you compare the CGM metrics that were taken off the DIY system and the sensor-augmented pump system, you can see that hypoglycemia levels are actually slightly lower than the sensor-augmented pump. Time in the target range was greater, time in hypoglycemia was significantly lower, and time in severe hypoglycemia was lower, which is exactly what you want to see. And in the secondary outcomes, you could see that the mean sensor glucose is significantly better, and the coefficient of variation is around the same. It's worth noting hypoglycemic event was defined using the standard model for, from the hypo-awareness group. So that's it in terms of what I've got to talk through with you. This is a set of useful links that you might want to have a look at that will take you through lots of the aspects of DIY APS systems and the We Are Not Waiting community. On Twitter, you also have this set of hashtags which you can search on and see what the chatter is about all of these things. I also write, as was mentioned, the diabetic.com blog, and all my musings relating to DIY systems, to the variations between CGM systems, testing out in an N=1 fashion how well they all work, is available there. And I'm also Tim's Pants on Twitter. So with that, are there any questions?
So Tim, if you can just stop sharing your screen, and then the rest of the panel can kind of start.
There we go.
Excellent, very informative talk. Just asking if any of the attendants has any question. Okay, can I ask you a question, Tim? Do you know, with the emerging systems such as the 670G, the promising 780G, and do you think the uptake of the DIY system might reduce, or do you think this might be another reason why people take more DIY systems?
I think it's an interesting question. I think that there are some people who will get out of the commercial systems things that they can't get out of the DIY system. So when I tested CAN-APS, I was very impressed with what I got. It was much better than I expected it was going to be. And in terms of the overall glycemic outcomes, the time in range over the month I used it was exactly the same as I get with OpenAPS. So that tells you that it's possible to get that. Now, One thing I would state is that with CAM APS, I did have to do more management than I do with Open APS. But I mean, that's par for the course, really. And I think what we'll see as the systems get more sophisticated, that management overhead will go away. And one of the things you kind of see with CAM APS was that it would note as you would pre-bolus, and therefore would start to give you insulin a bit earlier because it knew you were pre-bolusing, for example. Things like that come into play in the learning systems as they start to understand your routine and your timing for doing things, and then adjust accordingly. So I am aware of a number of people who have moved off DIY systems onto commercial systems. Those have predominantly been people using Loop onto Control IQ. I'm also aware of a couple of people who are considering moving off Android APS onto CAM APS permanently. So there will definitely be a migration. I think there will still be people who want to use the DIY systems because there's a flexibility and adjustability in there. But the fact that the newer commercial systems, and I don't include our Control IQ in this one actually, CAM APS, Diaboloop, and 780G are able to adjust themselves to fit you constantly, does appeal to a lot of people. Not having to make sure you're aware of what you have to do to tweak basal settings and the other settings on the system does appeal to quite a lot of people. I think we're probably at peak DIY at the moment, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be taken up in places where the cost of access to these other systems is way too high. So, for example, the developing world and in India, if you can get access to a pump and you can get a free closed loop system, if you can afford the CGM, or if you can get one of the newer CGMs that are supposed to be cheaper and have that integrated, I still see a role for DIY to play for better glucose control in a place where people can't afford to access commercial systems.
Thank you very much. Yeah, brilliant. So I just realized we have Professor Shaw with us. I just want to extend a warm welcome to him. Prof. Shaw is the clinical lead for diabetic regenerative medicine, islet cell transplant, and from Newcastle University. Welcome, Prof, on board. Any questions? Yeah, Ali, please.
Yes, thank you, Tim, for the comprehensive run-through. A question, would the DIY systems recognize or pick up when the sensor is not working right, and when the noise in the sensor is not as expected? Would it alert the user to it? To look into it?
Within Loop, it runs off the Dexcom, off listening to the Dexcom data coming in, so it has that data in it. And within Open APS and Android APS, Dexcom generates noise data, and you can therefore use that noise data to determine what the algorithm should be doing. And certainly within Open APS, as the noise data increases, it makes Open APS do less stuff. It becomes less aggressive with what it's allowed to do, to the point where it will hold back from doing very much at all if it can't rely on the data. So it does have that capability within the systems.
Thanks, Ali. Any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, I can ask a couple of questions too. It was a great talk, really informative, thoroughly enjoyed it. A couple of things I wondered about. You talked about people with a desire to go onto autopilot with their diabetes. Has that been the true experience? Obviously, you talked also about teenagers maybe not persisting in those years.
So I talk about this quite a bit when I run various events for people who are using the systems, not living with looping. For me personally, I stuck with Open APS over Android APS and over Loop because it was the one that allowed me to do the most hands-off. And what I mean by that is, if I forget that it's going on, it actually does a very good job of bringing me back into line without me really having to do very much. Right now, the biggest challenge with any system is not the system algorithms themselves, it's the insulin. The challenge is that actually OREF1, CAM APS, Diaboloop, 780G, maybe not the 670G, and probably the versions of Loop that are currently in dev, you probably could get away with hands-off if the insulin was faster.
Yeah.
And I think we might see that with Lyumjev. But the reality is right now that because of the issues with the speed of insulin, and obviously some of the issues that pumpers have with Fiasp, it's possibly not as possible for some people. Now we know that Dana Lewis, for example, enters carbs on a watch and then with a mix of Fiasp and Humalog hasn't bolused for years as a result of that, and it worked very well for her. And about 80% of the time I can get away with similar, but there are times if you choose to eat certain things that you have to give insulin a lead time in order to have it do something, and that's really where the challenge comes into play. Or where there are things like pizzas or Chinese meals where some of the components of those meals result in long postprandial high risk where you may end up having to do something. But for me personally, the things that make it much more hands-off are the ability to schedule eating soon. So with eating soon scheduled, generally I can bolus with meal and not suffer a particularly bad postprandial high unless it's something with a lot of carbs in it. And when I say a lot, we're talking above about 70 grams. I'm using a combination of Humalog and Fiasp at the moment. And the ability to also preset exercise periods as well means that you can have it reducing insulin when you're going to go and sort of play football or go for a run. If you do that on a regular schedule, you can have a preset period where it eases off so that when you do go for your run, you've not got as much insulin on board and it works quite well. But you have to do this scheduling around that because of obviously the time it takes the insulin to take effect and removal of the insulin to take effect. So the real driver to hands-off is how long insulin takes to act at the moment. But the algorithms are perfectly capable of making it with fast enough insulin a very hands-off experience. And right now, it's certainly a lot more hands-off than actually running without it. But I would also add to that the different systems have different levels of hands-offness. And a really good thing to look at was a poster presented at the ATTD conference this year that applied both Loop and Android APS to pigs. Now, why pigs? Well, pigs obviously can't manually intervene in taking insulin with a DIY system running on a phone because they've not yet figured out how to do that. So the outcome of that data was that Loop resulted in about a 45% time in range, while Android APS achieved about 65% time in range. So this is a pig eating its normal meals with an Android APS attached to it, and it's getting 65% time in range. So it's doing better than a lot of people using finger pricks and even CGM in the human world who know what they're doing. So the OREF1 algorithm that's running in Android APS probably has quite a lot going for it in that respect.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. I mean, I guess what I was thinking is that in the absence of the faster insulins, all of the community education and thinking that's been done around this to optimize the boluses, just as you've described, and to have that sort of preparing to eat time is really helpful. And I guess what I wanted to ask of the data with the comparators with the sensor augmented pump, is that just the standalone two systems, or is that with predictive low glucose suspend?
That was just a sensor augmented pump. So this was, I think it was a 640G that they used on that one. I don't think there was enough basal IQ available at the time, so it would have been sensor augmented pump classic, not predictive high and low glucose. Just predictive low glucose. On the eating soon point, there are actually now clinicians who are talking to their patients about using that when they're approaching meal times.
I think it's very interesting indeed. Thank you.
Another question, Tim, if I may?
Go ahead.
Right. Thanks to you and all the people who contributed to the open APS, which was kind of the driving force behind accelerating technology advancements in industry as well as in the community. Are you aware of any work going on at the moment with integrating wearables with the APS algorithm? For example, the accelerometers.
People have been experimenting. People have been experimenting with Fitbit, getting the data off that to allow combination of heart rate and step information to change the way insulin works. There are also some of the other things that are going on in the DIY community. People have been working on a dual hormone model, which works with 2 omnipods, with glucagon and with insulin. At the moment, it's something you would use for exercise because it's only a 24-hour glucagon, but that's something that people have been experimenting with as well. So there are quite a lot of things that people are looking at on the communication between the phone and the pumps, so the Riley link. A NASA engineer got involved in making a much more effective radio transmitter that we hope to see come out fairly soon. So there's a whole host of things going on, but those are probably the highlights that I can think of off the top of my head.
Any more questions from the audience, please? I have one final question. There's a great support, Tim, the open APS community is doing to each other. Do you think we should, or maybe think about doing similar thing, sorry for that, doing similar thing in terms of a starting insulin pump, like mentorship between old pump user and new pump user, such kind of interactive support or mentorship?
So it's an interesting one, right? A lot of people, before they get an insulin pump, go onto social media and ask, what insulin pump should I get? And certain people, like Nerdabetic, have produced a video that says, this is why you should pick an insulin, this is what you should think about when you're looking at getting an insulin pump. And then when people have problems with getting their insulin pumps right, some of them will come to the clinic about it, but others will ask online, in the Facebook groups, on Twitter, I keep having hypos, what do I need to do about it? How do I deal with this? So a lot of that's going on already, but I don't think it hurts at all to have people who are considered expert users, and I hate that term, but people who understand how it works and understand the things you need to tweak to get good results, operating with these things and trying to use them alongside others. So if you've got a group of I guess it's kind of like trusted advisors who you know are reasonably sensible, understand everything really well and understand what's going on, I think it's a great idea to have them helping new users to understand what's happening. And I think that's even more important when you move on to the hybrid closed loop systems. You need people who are familiar with the hybrid closed loop that someone's going on to help them understand what they might need to adjust. And you're already seeing that in the community now. So one of the things I mentioned earlier, that with Control IQ, you still have issues with settings. People have to adjust their settings to get Control IQ to work properly after using a pump, because Control IQ is downloaded on top of your existing pump settings, as you do with Loop, as you do with OpenAPS, as you do with Android APS. So if those are not well identified, you're going to have issues from the word go. And what we've identified in the DIY community is that people generally start with either their basals too high and then their carb ratio and sensitivity factor set to be too weak, because they are counteracting the fact that their basals are too high by not giving as much insulin for food or corrections, or it's the other way around, where the basals are too low, so they over-insulate for food and for corrections. And it's generally that their basal rates are too low and they overdo lunch and the evening meal dosing for bolusing, and therefore correction factors are also linked to that. But if you consider that that's something that affects you quite significantly on Control IQ, it's worth having people who use Control IQ there and able to have that conversation. And I think the same is true with things like CAM APS and others, when I was trialing CAM-APS, I was talking to a couple of other people I knew who had just started using it as well. And we were able to discuss some of the things we were seeing, some of the issues that were arising, and how we might deal with it, and things that you can adjust to try and make it work better. So it's a very, very key part of learning to use these systems is doing it with people who are also learning and also who may be able to provide some guidance.
Very interesting, very interesting. Thank you very much, Tim. Any more questions? Prof. Shaw, yes, please.
Yeah, it just made me think, with everything that's happening with COVID at the moment, obviously we're thinking about virtual consultations, we're doing those. What's your view on the new normal? How can we really turn this around to the advantage of people with diabetes really being in the driving seat, including in their clinical consultations, and what really a night scout for clinical diabetes management? How we are not waiting. What might that look like?
Well, I think we've already seen an example of that in Bulgaria. Certainly, Night Scout can be shared with anybody. So if one of your patients is using Night Scout, they can give you the URL and you can see it real time. You can run the reports in front of you in a clinic session. It's there. It's being run. I'm aware of a couple of, if you like, commercial-ish hosted systems being built out to make it easier for people to run Night Scout. One of those is in Finland, and theirs is actually being done in line with the Finnish government, who are providing the Finnish government, or is it one of the largest hospitals that runs the trusts model over there, where they are building this thing so that people can use it as part of their overall healthcare package. And there's another one that's being built out of the US, which allows you to have a hosted package for Night Scout that can be set up and run, and it has SLAs, it has uptime, it has all this kind of stuff. So that the reporting system is, you have to pay for it, you don't have to pay a lot, and it will give you the full lack of having to manage it yourself. So those kind of things come into play. I think the bigger challenge is convincing the commercial companies to allow free access to the data to get to those systems, because at the moment, whilst there's a way of getting Dexcom share into Night Scout, Medtronic's is very difficult. Abbott's, you have to use a third-party add-on. Having said that, a lot of people do, but you still have to. So it's not straightforward to get that data into a single system that can use it all. And that's probably the biggest question of the whole lot, is how do we get the commercial companies to really provide free access to our data so that we can choose where we want to host it in order to make it more useful to us and more useful to those we deal with. But I would highly recommend, if you've got people using Night Scout, just ask for the URL and look at it in the clinical meetings. And I mentioned Bulgaria, where they've actually built out Night Scout monitoring for inpatients in one of the pediatric wards, where they have a PC with a large screen and with multiple Night Scout windows, and every child that comes in is using a Dexcom transmitter. I think they're refurbished Dexcom transmitters on the G5s, and those are being used to monitor all of the inpatient children who have diabetes, and therefore get alerts when children are going low or when they're too high, to allow clinicians and specialist diabetes clinicians to help deal with that. But Night Scout gives you a really good way of sharing data, and it's been something that people have been doing in the community for a long time to help diagnose what's going on. And it's worth catching up with clinicians and with those of us in the community who understand what some of the patterns look like, to have that conversation around, okay, what are things that you might want to look out for if you're going to use something like Night Scout, especially if people are looping, but also even if they're not.
Thank you very much.
If no further questions, I think thank you very much, Tim. Very interesting session, and thanks everybody who joined us. I wish you good luck. And for the last thing, I just want to mention for all healthcare professionals, there should be a JDRF and Diabetes UK guidelines on DIY closed system. There's some position statement which was published earlier this year for further information, for further reference as well. Thank you very much, and thanks for coming back.
And I can make the slides available if anybody wants them.
Thank you.